when you study your target species and you understand their life cycle and why they do what they do and when they do it, you can look like a genius.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby.
Hey, JD, good to see you again. Good to be back here.
Right? Good to be back here on episode number 3.
Yeah, I just got back from Bass Pro Shops in Utica and Auburn, New York, 2 days. First weekend of their Spring Fishing Classic. That is an awesome event. It's their biggest sale of the year. And for the month of March, I get to be in a different Bass Pro Shop store every Saturday and Sunday, every weekend, doing tank demos, mini seminars, and showing people how to catch more fish. And I love it. I absolutely love it. I get to be the guy in the tank. And hey, living a dream. How about you? How was your weekend?
My weekend was not fishy, but it's okay. I feel that I'll be getting more days in soon. I wanted to get out today, but
it's gorgeous today.
Gorgeous out there. The river's just a little bit too high.
We've had a lot of rain, a lot of runoff.
So let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Bassmaster Magazine, where do you get it?
From my subscription. I'm a life member of Bassmaster, so that comes with a lifetime subscription to the magazine. Same as in Fisherman, I'm a lifetime member there. I get the magazine every month, rest of my life. Same thing with the NRA. I'm a lifetime endowment member. I've upgraded my lifetime membership twice now. And
to an endowment level.
Yeah, I donate.
In the world of fundraising, Roy, endowment is it's a pretty serious word.
Yeah. Well, that's the level that they call it.
Wow. You and I were having a chuckle about the sticker phenomena of Bassmasters, and it brought me back to when I used to get in the mail the North American Fishing Club.
The North American Fishing Club. Oh yeah.
Now, here's what they did that was brilliant. They made you feel special by sending that thing. Everything was personalized.
Yep. Like you're a big deal.
You could have your own fishing rod with your name on it.
Yep.
The Roy Bilby model.
I can have that. I just need a nice bright Sharpie that shows up on the rod blank.
You ever built a rod?
I've had rods built for me. I've never built my own. I built my first ice fishing jigging rod, but that was out of a broken fiberglass rod decades ago, many decades ago.
You had mentioned that before.
Yep.
Interesting. Do you think that building your own rod would take your fishing to the next level?
If you're going technique specific, it could absolutely help. And there's a lot of pride in catching fish on something you've built yourself. But I mean, I get my rods from Bass Pro Shops, and they have a rod for everything. So I'm not in any kind of position where I feel I need to build my own rods. And I don't say that. I'm not bragging about that. Anybody can get rods from Bass Pro Shops. I'm just saying they have every length, every style, every action, every technique specific rod I need, that I feel I need when I compete or when I'm just out fun fishing. I'm totally content with the arsenal I have from them. Totally content. But rod building would be cool. I know several guys that do it, and I've had 3 rods custom built for me by guys I've had out numerous times, and I got students from the Bass Club that I got really close with, and they became family, and we have fished together a lot and are looking forward to fishing more in the future. Speaking of taking your fishing to the next level, I want to touch on that, because I was able to do that, and I got thinking about that. I mean, I catch 1,000 bass every year for the last 17 years. And last year when I was fully retired, I set a goal of 2,000 and I accomplished that. That's one species, 2,104 bass in 2023 I caught and released. And that's in addition to, I mean, I had 700 perch. I had a couple hundred crappie. I mean, a pile of bluegill, a bunch of walleye, all my target species. And I keep track of those too, but I've never done a running tally of them. I just total it at the end of the year because that's me. I count everything. I'm a counter. I have digital counters. I've got a box that's got 12 digital counters in it for 12 different species. If I'm going to a lake where I'm just going to run into everything, even if I'm targeting a particular species. And I got thinking about it, and I did some review and I did some self-checking, and there was basically 6 steps that I took that helped me take my fishing to the next level. So I've started doing seminars on that because my job is to pass on fishing knowledge, and I figured, hey, let's teach everybody how to take their fishing to the next level. It's not rocket science. It's 6 simple steps that I took, but I outlined them so people can use the same formula. I mean, if it worked for me, I think it can work for anybody, and it definitely took my fishing to the next level. So when I did a seminar on it, I just outlined 6 steps on a whiteboard. And step number 1, take notes. Not rocket science, real simple. We're all students of the game. And I talked in the first 2 episodes here about my journal keeping and how that showed me what a difference keeping records can make. That I mean, the second year my numbers more than doubled. Third year they quadrupled. I mean, my success rate went through the roof. Yeah, I probably had a few more entries in my journal each year, but I was learning so much that my success rate went straight through the roof. And of course, my journals are highly detailed, and it's different for everybody. I've had a lot of students that went out with me and they like, hey, I'm taking notes now. I'm like, that's awesome. That's gonna improve you as an angler. And my goal is to always do better than I did the last time. So taking notes was really the catalyst. Those journals, that was the catalyst that took my fishing to the next level. But there were other steps I incorporated along the way as I look back on it, that all these things together are what really had the impact and made the difference for me. And keeping a journal, taking notes, that was the first domino in a row that started knocking them all down. But that second domino, step number 2, study your target species. And this is critical. Back then I wanted to be a better bass fisherman. That's what I was looking to accomplish with all this study and note keeping. And study your target species. I studied bass. I watched every episode of Bassmasters. I read the magazine. In fishermen, I'd go straight to the bass articles first thing, and they were usually the first 1 or 2 articles in the magazine because bass fishing was such a big sport and still is. But I have a classic example for study your target species, and I talk about this a lot. I'm a multi-species angler. I don't limit myself to one fish or one species. Right now, we're in March, and this is when our ice goes off the lakes up here. And this year it happened early. We didn't have much ice cover. Good grief. Since December, I ice fished twice and I was in a boat 9 times. I mean, I call it a Tennessee winter. They call it an El Nino winter, call it what you want. I was in a boat more than I was on the ice, and the ice I was on was 4.5 inches. So we just never had good, solid ice cover. We just didn't. If you wanted to ice fish, you had to go north, and I'm not going to do that if I can put a boat out, because I love to ice fish. I was raised ice fishing, and I do love it. But my passion is standing in that boat and going across the water hunting whatever I'm throwing for. So if I can do that, that's my first choice. So I was able to do that a lot this winter. But studying your target species, when the ice first goes out, I'm looking for perch because I love to eat yellow perch, as a lot of people do. There's not a fish that's better on the table, in my opinion. I prefer it to walleye, and a lot of people like walleye. I do too, but I think perch has more flavor. That's why I like it better.
You know,
And
the thing is about with your studying and your hunting your fish.
yeah,
That's overlooked by so many people because they usually just sit and they'll stand on one spot. If they're bank fishermen, they'll stay
Yeah.
in one spot, and then
Yeah.
after about 75 casts, they'll get fed up for the night and walk away. And it never even occurred to that person to move and go look, like to go.
And
You know
throw-
what? So
throw
many.
into some fresh water.
Yeah, like go 75 feet down shore. Maybe it'll be a different situation.
That occurs to me after 3 casts, I'm telling you.
Is that how impatient you get?
Yeah, I'm not impatient. I'm just, if I didn't get a fish in 3 casts, I'm throwing someplace else. I'm covering water until I locate them.
3 casts.
And the good days are just when you got your first 3 casts and you got your first 3 fish. A lot of people think you don't want to catch a fish on the first cast. That's a bad luck.
It is bad luck.
Yeah. Sorry. And
Serious?
You can quote me on that.
Oh, come on. That day that I was out there with you, I caught a fish on the first cast and I didn't catch anything for the next 45 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I remember that. That wasn't bad luck. That's just the way it went down. If I'm fishing a tournament and I catch one on the first cast, guess what? I'm one ahead of everybody else. I only need to get 4 more in that box for a limit. That's the way I look at it.
But I'm just trying to think, you and I were fishing the same. I think at that point, you and I both had a Senko on.
Yeah,
and
we did.
We were fishing right next to each other. The only difference was I had a spinning rod and you had a bait caster.
Yep.
And, I think our action was similar.
Yeah. But you were throwing braid, I was throwing mono, which, those were the only differences. I was going to start with my spinner bait because when I go to water I haven't been on a long time, that's a great search tool. But you fired a cast out and caught one on a Senko first cast, and I said, no, I guess I'm starting with a Senko if that's what they're going to hit. I'm determined. I'm not stupid.
Not that I was trying to impress you, but I was stoked that I caught a fish before you did.
Yeah. No, hey, I was happy for you. I don't care who catches them first. We're a team. Let's figure it out. When we're out there together, let's figure it out.
So before you go on to your next step, are bass that line shy?
In heavily pressured lakes where they're just bombarded all the time, yeah, they learn to be line shy. The fish in your lake now, because hardly anybody's allowed to fish it right now. There's those restrictions, but you live there, so you can.
Right.
That's why when you invited me, I said, yeah, I'll be right there. Because I'd been wanting to get on that lake for months, and you can't get on it. But when a resident invites you, hey, giddy up.
Absolutely.
Be right there. Yeah, study your target species, step number 2. And I'll use yellow perch as an example because I would do that every spring as soon as the ice went out. My first 3 weeks are dedicated to getting some fillets in the freezer. And last year, in those 3 weeks, we put 430 perch over the side of my boat. That's not what we put in the freezer. I harvest selectively, and it's a renewable resource, but not if we keep every one. So I would encourage listeners to please harvest selectively. Our 2 best days, we had 78 and we had 134, our 2 best days. But we kept a portion, okay? I'm not, number one, I don't want to clean that many fish. On a really, really good day, I'll keep half a limit. That's about as many fish as I want to clean. Many days, I'll only keep 10 or 15. I just don't want to spend that much time cleaning fish, and I want an excuse to go back. So we have a fish fry every Monday night, my dad and I. He's 89, and my job is keeping us in fresh fillets, and we've been doing it for over 3 years, and we have never gone hungry. So, let me get to my point here. I used to fish for the yellow perch in the spring when the ice first went out. We had a lake. It was a two-tier fishery. It had a shallow section that had a lot of pickerel in it, some rock bass, and a lot of largemouth. But the perch we always found in the deeper section. There was like an earthen dam that separated the two halves. The lower half that was the shallow part ran north and south, and the upper portion, the other side of that earthen dam, and when the water's up in the spring with snow melt and runoff, it that's underwater by a couple feet, sometimes 2.5 feet. You can float right across it. But if the water's down, you gotta just portage over it. It takes a minute. But that upper half runs east and west, and it runs parallel to some old D&H railroad tracks, and it plunges right down to 28 foot deep. But that's the side that we would find the perch in. However, we never found them in that deep, deep basin. We found them right against that earthen dam in the, me just turn it around in my head. It would be the northeast corner of that upper portion. And where that dam would taper down, it would come off the north bank as well and make a corner there. And it dropped down to a little shallow flat that was, I don't know, 6 to 8 foot deep. And it dropped down into about 12 and stayed there. And then it would just drop gradually into 16. It leveled off again. And then it would just plunge into the 20s, into that 28-foot basin. Now, in the spring, the only place we could catch those perch was in that northeast corner where it was 6 to 8 foot deep. There was some brush in the water, some tree limbs and branches, and there was a little bit of vertical vegetation starting up off the bottom. And that's where we always used to catch the perch. Some days we would clean house, and other days that were seemingly like 2 days later, it's, we just crushed them here 2 days ago. Where are they? It was a ghost town. And I couldn't figure out, I had enough success because I fished it enough, but there would be 2 or 3 days when we absolutely whacked them, and a couple days where it was a ghost town. Why are they here and then gone, here and then gone? Well, a few years later, a good friend of mine who worked for the state agency that takes care of our fisheries and wildlife, he handed me some printouts from some of their manuals. He goes, "Look, I know you fish a lot. You'd probably appreciate these." And he gave me 3 or 4 pages on each, several of the different species I fish for. And one of them pertained to yellow perch. And I was reading that, and it taught me that in the spring of the year, perch move into spawn when the water's between 42 and 48 degrees. So when the state agency goes out onto a lake, a body of water, to do a census on the perch population, they know the fish will be shallow to spawn in that temperature range. So they wait till the surface temp is 45 degrees, right in the middle of that range. And that's when they go and electrofish, and they bring them up, they count them, they measure them, they put them back, and they're done with their census, easy peasy. But it also taught me that they look for water 7 to 11 foot deep that has vertical vegetation or brush that they can attach their egg strands to. Their eggs come out in sheets or strands. They do not lay them on the bottom. If they do, the silt will smother the eggs. They look for water in that depth range with something vertical they can attach their eggs to off the bottom, so they're basically suspended in the water column. And at that depth, the sun's rays can incubate the eggs in just a couple weeks. And that's when the light bulb went off. I mean, that flat that we always caught them in, that met all that criteria. It was 6 to 8 foot deep. It dropped to 12. Well, there's your 7 to 11 foot range. And it did have some vertical vegetation starting up and a lot of brush. So the next time I went there and we were really catching them, I mean, the water temp was like 44 degrees. I'm like, okay, this is right in that range. And bam, it was magic. We just crushed them. And when we were done, I went in and looked, and sure enough, there were egg strands on those branches of that brush, in that shallow water. So it turns out these guys that wrote these manuals, they knew a lot about what they were talking about. So that got me to thinking, I bet I want to go back in my journals, and here's where taking notes comes into play. I reviewed my journals from the 3 prior years. And once you know, those days we absolutely crushed the perch that I was talking about, those 2 or 3 days, the water temperature was right in that range. But the days when it was a ghost town and I was questioning where, you'd catch one, you'd catch a couple pickerel. What happened to all the rest of the perch? Well, we'd had cold fronts that had come in, or we'd had some snow and it melted off, and the temperatures at night were in the 20s. That water temperature had dropped back to 38, 39 degrees, and they pulled away to a staging area. Now, given what I know now, I should have just pulled back and fished that 12 to 16 foot range where that secondary drop was, because that's where they would have gone. They would have just pulled back and held a little deeper until the water temperature was conducive to spawning again, and they would have just swam back up onto that flat. But that totally explained and confirmed for me in the records that I was keeping these records, not even knowing some of the things that they were going to show me later. And here I am. It's confirming what I read in those state journals, that they were here and gone because the water temperature dropped back. And then when it rose, they came back in. And that got me to thinking, well, shoot, if I can do this here, I can go to my other lakes where we occasionally catch perch, and I bet we can do this in the spring there too. So I started doing that. When you study your target species and you understand their life cycle and why they do what they do and when they do it, you can look like a genius. That's it. Step number 2, study your target species. Doesn't matter if it's bass, perch, crappie, bluegill. Doesn't matter if it's golden shiners. If you study it, you can look like a genius, and it absolutely will help take your fishing to the next level. Step number 3, this is a huge one. Challenge yourself. I have a habit of inflicting a program, and I call it that because there's no other way to say it. I inflict it upon myself, and it's a little deal I call setting myself up for failure to see if I can succeed. And by that, I mean, I look for the most negative conditions that exist, and I put myself right in the middle of that just to see if I can figure out the puzzle of how to catch fish when you got 3 strikes against you. The best example I have of this is, and again, a lot of this happens in the spring. We have a river about 20 minutes from my house. It is chock full of smallmouth and walleye, one of my favorite places to fish. And I was there one spring. It was the only place open. All the lakes still had ice, and I mean ice cover, because I'm the guy that's out there when 10% of the lake is open water and the other 90% is ice. I'm that guy.
Hold on. So have you ever hit, because out here at this lake, one thing you have to watch out for is that it could be like the ice being off could be misleading, and there could be ice underneath the water that's open. So have you ever accidentally gone out, have you ever like ran aground on ice in your boat when it's
only about 4 or 5 times?
What do you do when that happens?
You do your best. You stop immediately and just let it coast to a stop. And then if you can, you reverse your way out of it. If usually that early in the year, I'm not out with an outboard. If I have a motor, it's an electric, and I'm in one of my smaller boats.
Okay, good. You're not out there. You're not out there in the nitro.
I'm not running 65 miles an hour and all of a sudden stopping. No, I'm not doing that. I won't run my big motors until the water temperature is up somewhat, and I don't have to worry about anything freezing on a lower unit driving home. I'm cautious in that regard. But this particular spring, it was in March, and the lake still had ice cover, but the river opened up, and we'd had a lot of rain, which helped the ice get carried off the river. But it also rose the water level, and we had a lot of snow melt and runoff. And that with the heavy rains, this river, it was chocolate milk. And it was not out of its banks, but it was right on the verge. So there was a lot of current, way more than you want. The visibility when I got there, I put a black jig below the surface and 2 inches below the surface, 2 inches, it vanished completely. So visibility was 2 inches, next to nothing. And couple that with when I took the water temperature, it was 33 degrees. It was 1 degree from being solid. So, I mean, there's three major kisses of death. Way too much current. The creek is blown out. It's chocolate milk, and it's ice cold, ice cold. So I had 3.5 hours to fish, and that's the other thing. When I do these trips, I limit myself. I pride myself in not getting skunked. It happens. I mean, nobody's perfect, and I'm certainly not, and I'm tragically human at times. But I pride myself in not getting skunked for as long as possible. The longest string I had when I first started keeping track was 85 consecutive days without getting skunked. That was a heck of a run. But when I did this trip and put myself in those negative conditions, I was in the middle of the longest successful string I'd ever had. I was up over 100. I was flirting with 200. I was like in the low 180s and like 182, 183 trips, something like that, without being skunked. And I wanted 200 really bad. And that particular string ended at 230 consecutive trips. I'll never forget it was in the summer. We were fishing for walleye one night when I finally got skunked. And I knew that day would come. It can't last forever, but it was kind of bittersweet. It was actually a relief because, I mean, the last 50 or so trips, I was in no man's land as far as successful trips. I was like, how long is this going to last? And I was on pins and needles. I was a wreck every trip until I caught something. And the only pressure there was, it was totally self-imposed, but I was on a heck of a run, and I wanted to see how far it could go.
So
but to me,
so by contrast, what is your longest skunk spree, like streak? How many times have you gone out without catching anything?
2 days in a row, and it killed me. And I'm not kidding. That's since I've started keeping track. Probably in the early days, there was more than that. I'm sure there was. There had to be. But for the last 20 years or so, I got skunked twice in a row just a couple of years ago. And I'm like, what is going on?
You poor thing. You poor thing.
And I know there's people listening going, oh, that poor thing, Cry Me a River.
I'm
playing
one of
little
them.
teeny violins.
Yep. Listen, when you're not, I mean, I know that you've definitely paid your dues and you've worked to get to where you are, but for all of us out there who go on a wing and a prayer, for me, it's how many, when am I going to finally catch a fish versus,
I've been there.
When am I not going to catch a fish?
But that's why I'm doing that's why I'm doing this for our podcast, because I think it's going to help people catch more fish. I mean, that's my goal here. I've said before, I'm not here to brag, or it's not an ego trip, because I know there's fishermen out there that are way more accomplished than I am. I'm just in a position to share what I've learned, and I have a passion for sharing that. And you've given me another vehicle to do that. So that's why I appreciate you, JD.
Hey, no problem. I appreciate you, Roy.
Well, we'll have our own little
We're having our own appreciation circle on the podcast tonight. I
There you
appreciate.
go.
We're doing all the big affirmations this evening. This is an affirmation episode. 'Cause I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, I catch fish every time I go out.
So this 230 consecutive trips, it ended on a night when we were walleye fishing, and the guy that had me out on his boat, the good friend of mine, George, he had a Lund, and we were on Canandaigua Lake, and we decided we would stop at midnight. We both had to work the next day, and he'd caught 3 fish that night. I'd hooked 3, but I never landed a single one. They all shook off, pulled off, jumped off, and I just couldn't get it done. And here it is midnight, making that going home cast. And I drew a blank, and he was begging me, just keep fishing. Just keep fishing until you catch one. I turned to him, I said, that will mean absolutely nothing to me. We set a parameter here. We've been out here for 6.5 hours. If I can't get it done in 6.5 hours, it's the consecutive string is over. It's got to end somewhere. He's like, well, I don't want it to end in my boat. And I said that we said midnight. It's midnight. I didn't get it done. Kudos to you for catching 3 tonight. I couldn't get them in the boat. And that's where it ended. But this trip I'm talking about, where I really, really set the deck against me, I mean, it had it stacked against me heavily. I gave myself 3.5 hours to try to catch fish that day. And after 2 hours, I'm dragging both anchors. Okay. I got 2 anchors set, and I'm still moving down current. There was so much flow to this river at this time with this muddy water. And I was using my usual deal, which is in the spring, they're not going to chase when the water's that cold. They're not going to chase moving baits. You're not going to get them on a crankbait. It's way too early for a jerk bait. Swim bait ain't going to cut it. Spinner bait, none of that stuff. So I use jigs. These fish are on the bottom looking for something tumbling along, or in this case, on a sprint with all that current. So I'm using my standard jig, which for me is a 1/4 ounce, throwing a grub on it, something small and compact, and I'm throwing it up current. And there's so much current that 1/4 of the way through my retrieve, it's already past me, behind me, on the surface because of all the current. And it took me 2 hours. Good grief, this is how thick my head was. It took me 2 hours to figure out, well, this isn't working. 2 hours. Give me a break. This is a guy who always catches fish. Good grief. So I sat down in the boat. I had an hour and a half left, and I'm frustrated at this point. And I had a little conference with myself, went something like this. Well, mister, I have to challenge myself. You've challenged yourself right into a 0. I hope you're happy with 182 trips, because if you wanted to break 200, you never should have come here today. What are you going to do? So I started looking through my box. I knew what I was doing wasn't working. I knew I needed a lot heavier jig to get down to the bottom. It's just, the bottom line here is these fish are not going to be anywhere but on the bottom, where there's boulders and rocks and deadfalls and logs that break the current. They're not going to fight that current. They're going to be somewhere where they're protected from it. So they're behind bridge abutments, behind boulders, behind anything on the bottom that breaks that current. And I'm just not getting down there. So I dug around, and I don't even know why I had this, but I found a 1/2 inch ball head jig, the only one I had. But I said, that's going to get down there. And I started looking around. I need a big, bulky bait, something that's going to get attention. I should either go with a bright color or a dark color. And I wanted it to appear natural. So I decided to go with I need something black. And I started looking around. And this guy, George, who I'd walleye fished with, he had given me a box of tubes one time. And he said, do you use these things? I said, yeah, all the time. He said, here, take these. I can't catch anything on them. And it was a box of tubes but they were not the standard tubes that I use. I use 3 and 3.5 and 4 inch tubes, like a Fat Gets It or something. That's what they were originally called.
Oh
Now
yeah,
we
the
just call
gets
them,
it, the gets
yeah.
it's.
Now we just call them tubes. Only about 2.5 inches long, and they were really bulky, like a flipping tube, really thick and big around, but short. And I'd never used them because they didn't look natural to me. But I thought, shoot, there's something, there's a bulky profile, but it's not too long. So a smallmouth can get it in his mouth. And I found some that were black with red flake. That's called black neon. I went, perfect. I stuffed that jig inside there and tied it on. Now I've got a bulky profile and a real dark color that's black is going to get right to the bottom. And it's going to, if I can get it within 2 inches of their face, they'll see it. And with this current, they got to make a split decision and grab it or let it pass and go hungry. So I made my first cast up current. It was like somebody threw a rock. I mean, that thing landed in the water and went badoosh. I went, well, that's going to cut it. And it made it to the bottom. And I could feel it making bottom contact all the way back to my boat. And so that first retrieve, that was like, okay, this is good. Not getting snagged. I'm feeling bottom all the way back. Now we're cooking with gas. I got an hour and a half. Let's see if I can get this done. And it was my sixth cast with that bait. It stopped. I'm hung up. I'm snagged. And it looked so big and bulky to me. And now I'm snagged and I'm frustrated because I think I've really hung myself out to dry here because I have to challenge myself. And so I lean back on that rod, trying to either break it loose or snap the line. And if I do, that's the only 1/2 ounce jig I have. What am I going to do after that? But I'm so frustrated. I'm just leaning into that rod. And all of a sudden, I feel a surge. I guarantee you my eyes got as big as silver dollars because I had life on the other end. And I had that rod loaded. I cranked for all I was worth, got that fish up on the surface. And that poor fish, I water skied him all the way to my boat and swung him in. And I had my first fish. I was not skunked. I was so elated. There's a bridge that goes across this river in this town where it's located. It's the main drag. It's the main thoroughfare. It's Main Street. And it's constantly got traffic going both ways. Whoever was going by at that moment when I swung that fish into the boat, if they turned and looked, they had to be thinking, what in the world? Because there's a guy in an ice fishing suit, like a snowmobile suit, standing in a john boat in a sea of chocolate milk, and he's standing up, dancing in the boat, fist pumping in the air, going, thank you, Lord, thank you, awesome, because I wasn't skunked, and they may not get it, but I certainly was celebrating. I was not skunked I was so elated that in the most absolute worst conditions I could dream of, I went out and I figured out that puzzle. And that for me, that's the juice right there. I challenged myself more than I ever had and was able to pull it off. Once I realized that I was on the right deal and that would actually work, I calmed myself right down. And in that remaining hour and a half, I caught an additional 3 more smallmouth, all between 2.5 pounds, a really nice walleye and a huge fall fish. So I ended up with 6 fish, and I couldn't have been more happier. Yeah, you better. I guarantee you, I wrote that entry in red letters that day because those 6 fish that day, under those extreme negative conditions, meant more to me than 206 fish on a day when conditions were perfect and they're hitting everything that touches the water with reckless abandon because you hit them in a feeding spree. and conditions were ideal and you could do no wrong. I beat all odds that day in my humble opinion, and figured out the puzzle. So if you challenge yourself, if you put yourself in negative conditions, the water's too cold, there's too much wind, it's supposed to storm later on, I don't want to get caught in that. If you just go out in those less than ideal conditions, you're going to, and you're successful. If you push yourself to do that, you will end up being the guy that can catch them in all conditions. And for me, as a guy who was fishing tournaments, that was critical. We never get to pick the day when the tournament is. You never know what the conditions are going to be. They give you the schedule, at the beginning of the year, and you put those dates on your calendar. Whatever the weather is on that day, whatever the conditions are, everybody's got to deal with it. So by setting myself up in these negative scenarios time and time again throughout the year, even if I have something important to myself, like a consecutive string on the line, for me, making those entries in my journal where I don't get skunked, it doesn't mean anything unless I challenge myself, because anybody can catch them when they're always biting. But the guy that can catch them under any conditions because he's been there, he's done that, he knows how to deal with it and approach it, that's the guy that catches them all the time. And that's what I'm constantly working on becoming, is that guy that always catches them. So step number 3, challenge yourself. And trust me, that one is huge, and it will make a tremendous difference in your success as a fisherman and your ability to take your fishing to the next level. Step number 4, details. This is a big one, but it's a subtle one because most people overlook the details. I was just talking about that guy that always catches a fish. We all know somebody like that. We all know that guy that you could be sitting in the same boat with him, throwing the same bait in the same water, watching what he's doing and retrieving it the same way to the best of your ability. And he's catching them and you're not. I've been on the receiving end of that as well, but there's been times when I've had guys in a boat and I'm like, here, this is what they're hitting. Tie this on. Better yet, here, I'm cutting mine off. I'm giving you the one that they're hitting. I'm going to put on one just like it. Now we're both going to get them. And I'm still the only guy catching them. And when that happens, the thing that's critically, the thing that I've got on my side that guy doesn't is confidence and experience. I've caught a ton of fish on that bait. That's why I was throwing it in the first place. He's never thrown it. And it's amazing how you can give somebody, it just blows my mind how I can cut off the lure that I've been catching him on and tie it on his line, and he throws it and doesn't catch him, and just a totally different one that looks just like it I put on, and I keep like I never swapped them out. And the only explanation I have for that is I have a ton of confidence and experience with that bait. I know it's going to catch fish, but until someone else starts catching a few on it, they quite often doubt that it's going to work for them the way it did for somebody else.
So pro tip, folks, confidence.
Yeah. Did I just hear angels sing?
No, you just heard the that is correct. There was a little ding there, a little Easter egg bell.
The Easter egg bell. Still dropping Easter eggs.
I'm just going to start ringing the bell. Whenever you put down a good tip, I'm hitting the bell.
Cool. All right. Well,
from here forward. From here on forward.
Get a few more bell ringers. Doug Stange, he's the editor-in-chief of In Fisherman. There's a bucket list guy to spend a day in the boat with. I got so many questions for him. I have nothing but admiration for the career he's had and everything he's written about fishing. There's a man who's passionate about fishing. And I have a quote in my Hall of Rods. That's my, you've been there. That's the entry to my basement. I build a custom rod rack that holds 50 rods. That is the active duty roster. Those are the rods and reels I use for tournaments. For the right side is my tournament arsenal. The end cap is my ultralights, and that I'm using now for my perch. And the left side is all my fun fishing rods for bass. That is the active duty roster. But in this hall of rods, I have on both walls a lot of excerpts from magazines that I've cut out from pro fishermen that I admire and things that they've said, quotes they've made that really struck a chord with me. So I have one up there from Doug Stange, and he happened to be writing an article on those days when it's really, really tough to catch panfish that bite all the time, but they shut down at times. And at those times, he goes ultra finesse, which is the same thing I do. And because of his article, and it works. He started that article with this quote: details, nitpicky details. It seems to me the more I pay attention to the nitpicky details in my fishing, the luckier I seem to get. And yeah, that's hats off to Doug Stange for that little gold nugget, because that is the absolute truth. And details are what I keep in my journal that has shown me how all these factors come together. The guy that's paying attention to the details is the guy you're in the boat with, and you don't even notice that the wind changes direction. He's the guy that notices it was always at the back of his neck, and now it's hitting his left cheek. The wind changed. All right, I got to change my approach. Meanwhile, you're just doing the same thing you've been doing all day, and he switches his approach, and he starts loading the boat. He's the guy that notices when all of a sudden the leaves flip over and start turning up on the trees. That signals an approaching warm front or a drop in barometric pressure, which is a huge trigger for fish to feed. So there's all these details. See, it was sunny when we started. Do you notice when the clouds roll in? This guy does. He notices that now the fish are going to be spread out and they're going to be chasing more active baits, and he starts throwing a moving bait like a crankbait or a spinner bait. Next thing you know, he's loading the boat and he's not using the jig anymore. Oh, he switched. He didn't say anything. No, because he did it instinctively. And to see if that approach would work, and lo and behold, it does. Because he's not only noticing the details that everybody else misses, he's reacting to them and changing his approach and swinging things in his favor. So step number 4, pay attention to details. It's that simple. That's the whole point of keeping a journal. I write down all the details of what worked and what didn't work and analyze it, give my reasons why, given the conditions on every day, and every day's different. Step number 5, also a big one, set goals. You have to do that if you're going to improve. If you never set goals, where are you going to go in life? These are life lessons too. Everything I've said here, other than study your target species, can apply to life in general. The taking notes, the challenging yourself, paying attention to the details, setting goals. But in fishing, it also really applies and helps me take my fishing to the next level. I set goals every year, and the last 17 years of my working career, we touched on this in segment 2, while I was working a full-time schedule and had weekends off so I could approach a full-time team tournament club schedule, I was able to do that, yet still catch over 1,000 bass in a year. And I never thought I could do that while fishing tournaments and fishing unfamiliar waters. But those waters became more familiar to me. Catching bass on them became routine. And we're going to get a limit? Yeah, we're going to limit, and we're going to cull, because that's what we do. We know this lake. And so the numbers went up. And I set a goal of catching 1,000 bass every year. That became my goal. Try to catch and release 1,000 bass. Some years it was 1,046. Some years it was 1,500. Some years it was 1,283. You know, it varied. But When I stopped working and retired, my first year of full-time retirement, my January to December first year was last year, 2023. You talk about challenging yourself, setting goals. I challenged myself to catch and release 2,000 bass in a year. I wanted to see if I could do it. Sky's the limit. Let's raise the bar. Let's set a goal of double what we've tried to do in the past because I I conceivably have all the time in the world, right? I have other commitments and obligations, but I'm able to fish a lot more than I used to because I don't have a work schedule. I'm busy all the time. I'm always doing something, not always fishing, but I did have 125 entries in my journal last year, and that's about 30 more, 35 more than I'd been posting the years prior. So I was I was able to accomplish that goal. I ended up last year with 2,104 bass, and we'll see where it goes this year. But I was able to accomplish that because I set a goal for myself, and I'm a goal-driven individual. I'm always trying to raise the bar on myself and take myself to the next level. Step number 6, the final step. Never settle for the status quo. Never accept somebody else's results as that may be the best that you can do. I'm not saying trying to beat everybody. I'm just saying don't settle for the status quo. A good example of that, there's a lake about 10 minutes from my house, and for years it was a good smallmouth fishery, but they didn't have good recruitment. They didn't have good spawns. Conditions weren't right. There were good smallmouth in that lake, but back in the day, if you caught 4, you had a stellar day. Nobody could ever catch a limit. And that's just the way it was. Nobody ever talked about getting a limit. The fish were very big, but they were few and far between. And then they had a couple successful spawns. We started seeing recruitment. We started seeing some smaller fish. We knew, hey, they're going to grow. They're going to come up through. It's about time we're seeing this because we didn't see it for years. You could still catch a few of those bigger ones, but it was still tough to catch a limit of quality fish. You could get a few more fish here and there, but you couldn't get a limit of 4 good fish. And the other thing about this lake was no matter how good the conditions seemed to be, you could never get a top water bite. You could never catch a fish on a top water. We never could. Everybody talked about it. Why can't you catch them on top water on this lake? And it was just common knowledge that they wouldn't hit a top water. Everybody knew it. But that was the status quo. If conditions were right for a top water, we'd throw it, but we wouldn't spend any time at it because we knew we were wasting our time, or so we believed, until one Saturday morning, I went there with a partner, and conditions were, it was early September. The air was still, there was mist coming off the water because it was a cold night, but the water was still in the upper 50-degree range. And it was just one of those classic with the fog and the mist on the water that everything was still. I went,
Let me guess. You threw a whopper plopper.
This was before a whopper plopper was a deal. Threw a tiny torpedo. Yeah, you remember those.
I've got them.
One prop on the back. I got them, still throw them.
The torpedo was smaller than the Zara puppy, right?
Than the Zara Spook, Zara Puppy. Yeah. Yep. Little bit shorter.
See, I know things.
Yeah. Where's your bell?
That one wasn't bell worthy.
Oh, yeah. Not bell worthy. I like that. So I turned to my partner. I said, probably not going to work, but I got to try a top water. And I fired it out there, waited for the rings to disappear. One twitched my rod tip, and that water exploded. I almost missed the hook set, caught me off guard. And I load up. I pull in a decent smallmouth. I went, you got to take a picture of this fish, and I'm going to put in my journal, in my picture album, top water, because that just didn't happen there. Next cast, same thing. By the time I had my third fish, like my fifth cast, this guy's going, "You got another one of those? Because I don't have any." I'm like, "Yeah, I sure do." We caught 25 smallmouth that morning, every single one on top water. The best word to describe that event was unprecedented. Had never happened before, and hadn't since. But this is why I say, never settle for the status quo. Had I not tried it and discovered that, we never would have had that stellar day that was so out of the ordinary because it went totally against the status quo. And that goes with raising the bar on yourself. Never, ever settle for the status quo. If they say it can't be done, go out and be the guy that proves them wrong. However, 3 days later, my partner calls me up, says, "Do you know what Saturday was?" I said, "Yeah, the most unbelievable day we've ever had on that lake, and nobody I've talked to believes me." They're like, "No, that didn't happen, not there." And they said, "Well, it was a lunar eclipse." I went, "Oh my goodness!" And this is where we back up to the details and the taking notes. I wrote that I went back to that journal entry and added in, "This was a lunar eclipse. No wonder." And the reason I say that is the moon phase has a tremendous impact on how fish react at different times. And a lunar eclipse, that's a lunar event. It only occurs once every how many years, like 30 years or something like that. And there's one at the end of this month, and I can't fish it because it's on a weekend. It's on the final weekend of the Bass Pro Shop Spring Fishing Classic, and I will be back in Utica and Auburn, New York, on top of their tank the day of the lunar eclipse. But I'll tell you this, I'm going to be watching how those fish strike, because if they're super, super active, I'm blaming it on the lunar eclipse because it will have an effect. And I don't care if they're in the tank or not. It's going to have an effect. There is a solar eclipse April 8th.
Yes, there is. And we are in the path of totality, as they say.
Yes, we are. And so are the lakes we fish. So I'm going to be experimenting that day to see if a solar eclipse has any kind of an impact on them. I remember doing a solar eclipse when I was like 11 years old, and they were warning you can't look directly at it. And I remember having the special glasses and standing out front in my parents' house and watching this thing happen with these special glasses that protected your eyes. And I was like 11 years old. That's the last solar eclipse I remember.
You can use a welding helmet, I think, as well.
Yeah, I believe you can, but not regular sunglasses.
No, you don't look
they
at
don't
this.
offer enough protection.
It's a good way to burn your eyes out of your head. Maybe you should grab a pair of binoculars. Look at it.
Yeah, but turn them around backwards. Yeah, there's
the bell.
Good for you. You got one.
Pro
you got
tip.
A bell worthy.
All right. Well, that's a very important 6 steps to take your fishing to the next level. And if you have any questions for Roy, drop us an email at anglerwithinpodcast@gmail.com. And, thanks for listening. We haven't said thanks for listening yet, I don't think.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. We're starting to see the numbers climb. And thank you so much for taking an interest in what we have to share. Our goal is just to make you a better fisherman and hopefully take your fishing to the next level. And to review, step number 1, take notes, study your target species, challenge yourself, pay attention to details, set goals, and never settle for the status quo. Now, all 6 of those steps are critically important, and you can do all the studying in the world, but none of it counts for anything unless you go out and apply it, because I can't stress enough that there is absolutely no substitute for time on the water. That's where you do the most learning.
So make sure you use all of these steps that you've heard today to find your
Angler Within.